In the brutal winter of 1942, deep in the frozen forests of Eastern Europe, a young woman crouched behind enemy lines with nothing but a rifle and years of hunting experience. She had already claimed over 300 enemy lives, earning her the nickname Lady Death among both her comrades and terrified enemies. But on this particular morning, as artillery shells screamed overhead and machine gun fire echoed through the trees, she would make a decision that would silence an entire battlefield with just 7 words. What could one woman say that would make hardened soldiers stop fighting? What warning could be so powerful that it would travel through trenches, bunkers, and command posts, causing even the most battle-tested warriors to pause their weapons? This is the true story of how a legendary female sniper's single warning changed everything in one of World War II's deadliest battles, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bullet. It's the truth spoken by someone who has earned the right to be heard. The noise of war would stop, but first it would get much, much louder. Ekaterina Volkova grew up in a small village outside Stalingrad, where the sound of gunfire was as common as birdsong. Her father, a veteran of the Great War, had taught her to shoot when she was barely tall enough to hold his old hunting rifle. By age 12, she could hit a moving rabbit at 200 yards. By 15, she was providing meat for 3 neighboring families during the harsh winters when food was scarce. The villagers called her Little Wolf because of her ability to move silently through the forest and strike without warning. She had an unusual gift for reading the wind, understanding how temperature and humidity affected a bullet's path, and, most importantly, she possessed an almost supernatural patience that allowed her to wait motionless for hours until the perfect shot presented itself. When the German invasion began in June 1941, Ekaterina was 19 years old and working as a factory supervisor in Stalingrad. She watched from her apartment window as the first wave of Luftwaffe bombers darkened the sky over her city. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard, a deep, thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. Within hours, the city she loved was engulfed in flames. Her younger brother Dmitri was among the first to volunteer for the Red Army. He was 17, barely old enough to shave, but his eyes burned with the fierce determination that ran in their family. Ekaterina begged him to wait, to think about their mother who had already lost their father to tuberculosis the previous winter. But Dmitri would not be swayed. 3 weeks later, she received news that would change her life forever. Dmitri had been killed in his first engagement, shot by a German sniper while trying to rescue wounded comrades from no man's land. The officer who brought the news described how her brother had crawled through barbed wire for nearly an hour to reach 3 injured soldiers. He had saved 2 of them before a single bullet found its mark. That night, Ekaterina sat in her empty apartment holding her father's old rifle. The weapon felt different in her hands now, not like a tool for hunting or sport, but like an instrument of justice. She made a decision that would echo through military history. If the enemy wanted to fight with snipers, she would show them what a real sniper could do. The next morning, she walked into the local recruitment office wearing her father's military coat and carrying documentation of her shooting achievements from various competitions. The recruiting sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Petrov, initially laughed at the idea of a young woman joining a sniper unit. His laughter stopped when she placed her targets on his desk. Groupings so tight they could be covered with a coin, all shot at distances that would challenge experienced marksmen. Petrov arranged for her to meet with Captain Mikhail Kozlov, who commanded the 3rd Sniper Company. Kozlov was known for his harsh training methods and his intolerance for anything less than perfection. He had trained over 200 snipers, and fewer than 50 had survived their first month of combat. When Ekaterina entered his office, he barely looked up from the maps spread across his desk. The captain's test was simple but brutal. She would have one opportunity to demonstrate her skills under conditions that simulated actual combat. He led her to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, where she was given a standard military rifle and pointed toward a series of targets positioned at various distances and elevations. What she didn't know was that Kozlov had positioned veteran snipers around the area who would fire live ammunition near her position to test her composure under fire. As Ekaterina settled into her shooting position, the first shot cracked past her ear, so close she could feel the bullet's wake. A lesser marksman would have flinched, spoiling their aim. Instead, she took a deep breath, found her natural point of aim, and fired. The first target, a German helmet mounted on a post 400 yards away, spun backward as her bullet struck dead center. The harassment fire continued as she engaged target after target. Bullets whistled overhead and kicked up dirt around her position, but her movements remained fluid and precise. She seemed to enter a trance-like state where nothing existed except the crosshairs of her scope and the target's downrange. In less than 10 minutes, she had engaged 8 targets at ranges from 300 to 800 yards, scoring perfect hits on all of them. Captain Kozlov was speechless. In 15 years of training snipers, he had never witnessed such natural ability combined with unshakable composure. More impressive than her marksmanship was her instinctive understanding of battlefield movement. Without any formal military training, she had chosen firing positions that offered excellent concealment and multiple escape routes. Her training began the next day and lasted 6 weeks. She learned urban camouflage, field craft, range estimation, wind reading, and, most importantly, the psychological aspects of sniper warfare. Kozlov taught her that a sniper's greatest weapon wasn't their rifle, but their mind. The ability to remain calm while under extreme stress, to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, and to carry the heavy burden of taking human lives. These were the true skills of a combat sniper. During this time, the Battle of Stalingrad was intensifying. German forces had pushed deep into the city, and house-to-house fighting raged through every district. The sound of gunfire, artillery, and aerial bombardment had become a constant background noise that the defenders learned to live with. Sleep came in brief moments between attacks, and food was whatever could be scavenged from the ruins. Ekaterina's first combat assignment came in November 1942. She was assigned to a sniper team operating in the factory district, where Soviet forces were desperately holding onto a series of buildings against overwhelming German attacks. Her spotter was Senior Sergeant Ivan Petrov, the nephew of the recruiting officer who had initially doubted her abilities. Ivan was an experienced soldier who had survived the siege of Leningrad, and his job was to help her identify targets, estimate ranges, and watch for enemy counter-snipers. Her first confirmed kill came on her 3rd day in combat. A German machine gun team had set up position in a bombed-out apartment building and was preventing Soviet reinforcements from reaching a surrounded platoon. The machine gun was well concealed behind rubble and sandbags, making it nearly impossible to spot from ground level. But Ekaterina had positioned herself in the skeleton of a burned factory, giving her an elevated view of the enemy position. Through her scope, she could see the machine gunner's shoulder and part of his helmet whenever he fired. It wasn't an easy shot, nearly 600 yards in windy conditions, with limited visibility due to smoke and dust. She waited for over an hour, studying the pattern of the gun's firing cycles and the way the wind affected the smoke drifting across the battlefield. When the opportunity finally came, she was ready. The machine gunner exposed himself slightly more than usual while adjusting his weapon's position. Ekaterina controlled her breathing, found her natural point of aim, and squeezed the trigger with the same smooth motion she had used countless times while hunting in the forests of her childhood. The machine gun fell silent instantly. Through her scope, she could see the other members of the German team frantically trying to determine where the shot had come from. Within minutes, Soviet infantry had advanced and secured the position, allowing the surrounded platoon to be resupplied and reinforced. Word of her accuracy spread quickly through the Soviet lines. Soldiers began requesting her support for specific missions, and enemy forces learned to fear the areas where she operated. She developed a reputation for impossible shots, targets that other snipers wouldn't even attempt. Her count of confirmed kills climbed steadily. 50, then 100, then 200. But with success came increased danger. German commanders began assigning their best snipers specifically to hunt her. Counter-sniper teams were deployed to areas where she had been active, and bounties were placed on her head. The psychological pressure was immense. Every position she occupied could be her last, and every shot she fired potentially revealed her location to enemy marksmen who were equally skilled and determined to kill her. The stress began to show in small ways. Her hands shook slightly when she cleaned her rifle at night. She startled at unexpected noises and found it increasingly difficult to sleep. The faces of her targets haunted her dreams. Young men, many of them barely older than her brother Dmitri, who had families and hopes and fears just like her own. She began to understand why so few snipers lasted more than a few months in combat. It was during this period of growing pressure and mounting casualties that she began to develop the philosophy that would eventually lead to her legendary warning. She realized that the true horror of war wasn't the killing itself, but the senseless waste of human potential on both sides. Every death, whether enemy or friendly, represented dreams destroyed and families shattered. The noise of war wasn't just the sound of guns and explosions. It was the screaming of human souls being torn apart by forces beyond their control. As winter deepened and the Battle of Stalingrad reached its climax, Ekaterina Volkova had become one of the most feared snipers on the Eastern Front. Her confirmed kill count had reached 309, earning her the nickname Lady Death among both Soviet and German forces. But the young woman who had entered the war seeking revenge for her brother's death was beginning to understand that victory and vengeance were not the same thing. She had no way of knowing that her greatest moment and her most important contribution to ending the carnage was still ahead of her. The noise of war was about to teach her its final, most important lesson. By January 1943, the German Sixth Army was trapped in Stalingrad, surrounded by Soviet forces in what would become known as Operation Ring. But for the soldiers fighting in the ruins, the strategic situation mattered less than surviving another day. The city had become a maze of collapsed buildings, frozen corpses, and hidden dangers where death could come from any direction at any moment. Ekaterina had been operating in the same sector for 3 weeks, a bombed-out industrial area where every building was riddled with bullet holes and every street corner could hide enemy snipers. Her kill count had reached 347, making her one of the deadliest snipers in military history. But numbers meant less to her now than they had in the beginning. Each kill had become harder, not easier, as she began to see the human cost of her deadly precision. The German High Command had taken notice of her effectiveness. Intelligence reports described a female sniper operating in the factory district whose accuracy was disrupting their defensive operations. They assigned their most experienced sniper hunter to eliminate her, Hauptmann Klaus Weber, a former Olympic shooting champion who had been credited with killing over 60 Allied snipers on various fronts. Weber was methodical in his approach. He spent days studying the patterns of sniper activity in Ekaterina's sector, mapping locations where kills had occurred, and timing the intervals between shots. He interviewed survivors of her attacks and examined bullet trajectories to understand her preferred firing positions. Slowly, he began to build a profile of his target. What Weber discovered impressed and concerned him. This sniper demonstrated tactical awareness far beyond what he expected from Soviet forces. Her positioning showed sophisticated understanding of urban camouflage and battlefield geometry. She never fired from the same location twice, and she seemed to have an intuitive grasp of how her enemies would respond to her attacks. Most troubling of all, her accuracy at extreme ranges suggested natural ability that couldn't be taught. Meanwhile, Ekaterina was experiencing her own challenges. The constant stress of being hunted was wearing her down physically and mentally. She had lost nearly 20 pounds since the beginning of winter, and her hands had developed a slight tremor that made precision shooting more difficult. Her spotter Ivan had been wounded by artillery shrapnel and replaced by a young soldier named Alexei who lacked experience in sniper operations. The psychological pressure was even worse than the physical hardships. She had begun to recognize individual German soldiers through her scope. Men she had been tracking for days, but hadn't yet found the right opportunity to engage. She knew their habits, their mannerisms, the way they moved when they thought they were safe. In some disturbing way, watching them through her crosshairs had made them real to her in a way that her earlier targets had not been. One soldier in particular had captured her attention. He was a young German medic who repeatedly exposed himself to danger while treating wounded comrades. Through her scope, she had watched him crawl into the open to drag injured soldiers to safety, seemingly oblivious to the sniper fire that regularly swept the area. She had cleared shots at him multiple times, but found herself unable to pull the trigger. The medic reminded her of her brother Dmitri. The same selfless courage, the same willingness to risk everything for others. She began to wonder about his family, his life before the war, the dreams he might have for the future. These thoughts were dangerous for a sniper. Hesitation could mean death, not just for herself, but for the Soviet soldiers who depended on her support. It was during this period of doubt and exhaustion that Weber finally located her general area of operations. He had noticed that sniper kills in the factory district followed a pattern related to wind direction and time of day. This suggested that the shooter was working from elevated positions that took advantage of predictable atmosphere conditions. After studying the terrain for several days, he identified 3 buildings that offered the necessary sight lines and concealment. Weber set up his counter-sniper operation with Germanic precision. He positioned observation teams to watch all 3 buildings simultaneously while he prepared firing positions that would allow him to engage any of them quickly. He brought his own spotter, a veteran soldier named Heinrich who had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front and understood the deadly game they were playing. On the morning of January 15th, Ekaterina took position in a partially collapsed factory building that offered excellent observation of a key intersection where German forces had been moving supplies and reinforcements. The building was dangerous, weakened by bombing and artillery fire, but it provided sight lines that were impossible to achieve from safer locations. She had been in position for nearly 3 hours when she spotted movement in the intersection below. A German supply convoy was preparing to cross the open area, escorted by infantry who were clearly nervous about sniper activity. Among the escort troops, she recognized the young medic she had been tracking. He was staying close to the vehicles, ready to treat any casualties that might result from an ambush. Through her scope, Ekaterina could see the convoy's route would take them directly across her field of fire at a range of approximately 450 yards. The wind was steady, but not strong, and visibility was good despite the smoke drifting across the battlefield. It would be an easy shot for someone of her abilities. But as she settled into her firing position and began her breathing routine, doubt crept into her mind. The medic was walking alongside the lead vehicle, his medical bag clearly visible and his movements showing the careful alertness of someone who had learned to fear snipers. In the crosshairs of her scope, he looked impossibly young, barely old enough to be away from home, much less treating combat wounds in a frozen hellscape. While she hesitated, Weber's spotter Heinrich noticed a brief glint of reflection from her scope lens. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but Heinrich was experienced enough to recognize it immediately. He quickly directed Weber's attention to the correct building and provided a rough estimate of the sniper's position. Weber studied the building through his own powerful scope, looking for any sign of movement or additional reflections. The structure was heavily damaged, with multiple floors partially collapsed and debris scattered throughout. Finding a concealed sniper in such terrain would normally be nearly impossible, but Weber had advantages that most counter-snipers lacked. His Olympic training had given him extraordinary visual acuity, and his years of hunting enemy marksmen had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of human presence. After several minutes of careful observation, He noticed something that didn't belong, a small piece of fabric that moved slightly differently than the debris around it. It was part of Ekaterina's camouflage, a white cloth she had used to break up the outline of her position. To anyone else, it would have been invisible, but Weber's trained eye caught the unnatural pattern of its movement in the wind. As Weber prepared his shot, Ekaterina finally made her decision about the convoy below. She would let the medic pass, but engage one of the escort soldiers who was clearly armed and actively participating in combat operations. It was a compromise that satisfied her tactical obligations while respecting her growing awareness of war's human cost. She selected her target, a sergeant who was directing the convoy's movement and appeared to be the senior non-commissioned officer present. The range was 460 yards, and the wind had shifted slightly since her initial calculations. She adjusted her point of aim and began her final breathing sequence. At that exact moment, Weber fired. His bullet struck the concrete inches from Ekaterina's head, sending fragments of masonry into her face and filling the air with choking dust. She immediately rolled away from her firing position, but Weber's second shot was already on its way. This one passed through the space where her head had been just seconds earlier. For the first time since entering combat, Ekaterina found herself on the receiving end of precise, professional sniper fire. The experience was terrifying in a way that artillery bombardments and machine gun attacks had never been. This wasn't random violence. This was personal, methodical, and potentially unavoidable. Someone with skills equal to her own was actively hunting her with the same deadly patience she had used against so many others. She crawled through the rubble toward the building's rear exit, staying low and moving carefully to avoid creating noise or visible disturbance. Behind her, Weber's shots continued to probe her former position, each one demonstrating his thorough understanding of urban sniper tactics. He was systematically eliminating possible escape routes and forcing her toward areas where he could more easily observe her movement. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. For months, Ekaterina had been the predator, striking from concealment against enemies who couldn't locate or effectively respond to her attacks. Now she understood what her targets had experienced. The helpless terror of being hunted by an unseen enemy whose next shot might end everything. As she reached the building's ground floor, she realized that escaping Weber's immediate threat was only the beginning of her problems. He had demonstrated that he knew her general area of operations and possessed the skills to track her effectively. Unless she could eliminate him or successfully evade his search, her career as a sniper was effectively over. No position would be safe, and every shot she fired would potentially reveal her location to an enemy who had already proven his ability to find her. But there was something else in her mind beyond fear and tactical considerations. During those terrifying moments under Weber's fire, listening to his bullets probe her position with scientific precision, she had experienced a revelation about the true nature of warfare. The sound of his shots wasn't just the crack of rifle fire. It was the voice of war itself, speaking in a language of violence that consumed everything it touched. She understood now that the noise of battle wasn't just external sound, but an internal condition that infected everyone it touched. The constant tension, the dehumanization of enemies, the gradual erosion of moral boundaries. These were all part of war's noise, drowning out the quiet voice of human conscience that tried to remind combatants of their shared humanity. As she slipped through the ruins toward friendly lines, Ekaterina Volkova began to formulate an idea that would eventually silence an entire battlefield. But first, she would have to survive the most dangerous game of her life, a duel between two master snipers where the slightest mistake would mean death. The hunt had become mutual, and only one hunter would survive to tell the story. For 3 days, Ekaterina and Weber played a deadly game of cat and mouse through the bombed ruins of Stalingrad. Neither could gain a decisive advantage. Weber's tracking skills were matched by Ekaterina's fieldcraft, while her natural shooting ability was countered by a systematic approach and superior equipment. The duel had reached a stalemate that could only be broken by a mistake, a stroke of luck, or a fundamental change in tactics. During this time, Ekaterina barely slept and ate almost nothing. She moved constantly, never staying in one position for more than a few hours, always assuming that Weber was close behind her. The stress was breaking down her physical and mental reserves, but it was also clarifying her thoughts about the war and her role in it. She had begun to see the conflict differently since her encounter with Weber. The German sniper wasn't a faceless enemy anymore. He was a skilled professional doing his job with the same dedication and courage that she brought to her own missions. Their deadly competition had nothing to do with ideology or national loyalty, and everything to do with the simple fact that war had made them mortal enemies. On the third night, while hiding in the basement of a destroyed apartment building, Ekaterina heard something that would change everything. Through the thin walls, she could make out the voices of German soldiers who had taken shelter in the adjacent building. They were young men, probably no older than herself, and they were talking about home. One soldier described his family's farm in Bavaria and how his father had taught him to repair machinery. Another spoke about his girlfriend in Berlin and the letters she sent describing life in the bombed city. A third talked about his younger sister's piano recitals and how much he missed hearing her play. Their conversation was punctuated by the distant sound of artillery and small arms fire, but for a few minutes, they had created a small pocket of humanity in the midst of madness. Listening to them, Ekaterina realized that these were the same conversations taking place in Soviet positions throughout the city. Young soldiers on both sides were fighting and dying while dreaming of the same things: family, love, peace, and the chance to build something meaningful after the war ended. The only difference was the language they used to express their hopes and fears. This revelation crystallized an idea that had been forming in her mind since her duel with Weber began. What if there was a way to remind everyone, soldiers, officers, and commanders, of their shared humanity? What if someone with the credibility that came from proven combat effectiveness could speak a truth so fundamental that it would cut through the noise of war and reach the part of human consciousness that we're tried so hard to destroy? The opportunity came the next morning during what would later be recorded as one of the largest artillery bombardments in the Battle of Stalingrad. Both Soviet and German forces were engaged in a massive firefight across a wide front, with thousands of soldiers shooting at each other across the frozen ruins. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of explosions, machine gun fire, and rifle shots that made normal communication impossible. Ekaterina had positioned herself in a church bell tower that had somehow survived the bombing, giving her an elevated view of the entire battlefield. Through her scope, she could see soldiers from both armies advancing and retreating, taking casualties and fighting with desperate determination. The scale of the violence was overwhelming, and the futility of it struck her more powerfully than ever before. It was then that she saw Weber. He had positioned himself in a building approximately 800 yards away, and through the powerful scope on a rifle, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was older than she had expected, probably in his 30s, with graying hair and the weathered face of a man who had spent years outdoors. He was methodically searching for targets with the same patient professionalism she had observed in his tracking methods. As she watched, Weber identified a Soviet machine gun position and began preparing for a shot. The range was extreme, over 900 yards, but his equipment and skills made it possible. Ekaterina could see the Soviet gunner clearly through her own scope. He was a boy, probably 16 or 17 years old, operating the weapon with a mechanical efficiency that came from months of combat experience. She had a clear shot at Weber. The range was challenging, but well within her capabilities, and he was completely focused on his own target. One bullet would end the duel and eliminate the threat he represented to Soviet operations. It would also add another number to her kill count and enhance her reputation as an unstoppable sniper. But instead of taking the shot, Ekaterina found herself thinking about the conversation she had overheard the night before. The German soldiers talking about home had sounded exactly like Soviet soldiers she had known. Young men caught in circumstances beyond their control, fighting because they had no choice, dreaming of a life beyond war. Weber was no different. Through her scope, she could see that he wore a wedding ring and had what appeared to be a small photograph tucked into his helmet band. He had a family, people who loved him and were waiting for him to come home. Killing him would destroy those lives just as surely as it would end his. The same was true of every soldier visible on the battlefield below. Each one represented a web of human relationships, parents who had raised them, friends who cared about them, futures that would never be realized if they died in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. The noise of war was drowning out the voices of all those people, reducing human beings to targets and statistics. At that moment, Ekaterina made a decision that would become legendary in military history. Instead of shooting at Weber or any other target, she stood up in the bell tower where she could be seen by soldiers on both sides of the battle. Then, using the powerful voice she had developed during her childhood in the countryside, she shouted 7 words that would echo through the decades. "Stop. We're all somebody's children here." Her voice carried across the battlefield with startling clarity. The unique acoustics of the bell tower amplified her words, and the distinctive sound of a woman's voice in the midst of an all-male combat zone immediately captured attention. Fighting began to slow as soldiers on both sides tried to locate the source of the unexpected interruption. Ekaterina repeated her warning, this time in German, having learned enough of the language during her months of combat to make herself understood. Then she called out in Russian again, and then once more in German. Each repetition was delivered with the absolute authority that came from her reputation and her proven courage under fire. The effect was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had been engaged in life-or-death combat moments earlier found themselves looking at their enemies through different eyes. The simple reminder that every person on the battlefield was someone's child, someone's son, brother, husband, or father, cut through months of military conditioning and propaganda. Weber was among the first to lower his weapon. Through his scope, he had been watching Ekaterina as she stood exposed in the bell tower, delivering her warning with complete disregard for her own safety. He could have killed her easily, but something in her words and her courage made that impossible. Instead, he found himself thinking about his own son back in Germany and wondering what kind of world they were creating for the next generation. The silence began in small pockets and spread across the battlefield like ripples on a pond. Machine guns fell quiet first. Then, rifle fire decreased. And, finally, even the artillery began to slow as observers reported the unusual situation to their commanders. Within 10 minutes of Ekaterina's first warning, an entire sector of one of history's bloodiest battles had gone quiet. The silence lasted for nearly an hour. During this time, soldiers on both sides used the opportunity to recover wounded comrades, redistribute ammunition, and simply rest from the exhaustion of constant combat. Some enemy soldiers even made brief eye contact across the ruins, acknowledging each other's humanity with small nods or gestures. But perhaps most importantly, the silence gave everyone time to think. In the absence of gunfire and explosions, soldiers could hear their own thoughts clearly for the first time in weeks. Many realized that they had been operating on pure survival instinct for so long that they had forgotten why they were fighting or what they hoped to achieve. Officers on both sides eventually ordered the resumption of combat, and the fighting began again. But something fundamental had changed. The shooting was less intense, more selective. Soldiers were more careful about their targets, more reluctant to fire at enemies who weren't directly threatening them. The mindless fury that had characterized the earlier fighting had been replaced by a more measured, more human approach to warfare. Ekaterina remained in the bell tower for several more hours, occasionally repeating her warning when the fighting threatened to escalate. Her presence had become a kind of moral anchor for the entire battlefield, reminding everyone that there were limits to what human beings should do to each other, even in war. Weber never attempted to shoot her, despite having multiple opportunities. Later, he would write in his diary that killing someone who had shown such courage in defense of human dignity would have been worse than murder. It would have been the destruction of hope itself. As evening approached and the day's fighting wound down, Ekaterina finally descended from the bell tower. She had not fired a single shot, but she had achieved something far more important than adding to her kill count. She had demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, individual acts of moral courage could make a difference. Word of her warning spread quickly through both armies. Soviet propaganda initially tried to suppress the story because it suggested sympathy for the enemy, while German commanders were uncomfortable with reports that their soldiers had been influenced by enemy appeals. But the story was too powerful to contain, and within days it was being discussed in trenches, bunkers, and command posts throughout the Eastern Front. The incident became known as the Stalingrad Silence, and it inspired similar acts of humanity in other battles. Snipers on both sides began to show more discrimination in their target selection. Artillery observers became more careful about calling fire on positions that might contain medics or wounded soldiers. Small acts of mercy and restraint began to appear throughout the theater of operations. Ekaterina's own war ended 3 weeks later when she was wounded by artillery shrapnel while helping to evacuate wounded soldiers from a forward aid station. The injury was serious enough to end her combat career, but she had already accomplished something more lasting than any number of confirmed kills. She had proven that war's greatest victory wasn't the destruction of enemies, but the preservation of humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. Weber survived the war and eventually became a teacher in post-war Germany. He never spoke publicly about his encounter with Ekaterina, but he devoted his career to educating young people about the importance of seeing enemies as human beings rather than targets. His students remembered him as a man who understood the true cost of hatred and the precious value of compassion. Years later, military historians would debate the exact impact of Ekaterina's warning on the course of the Battle of Stalingrad. Some argued that it was a minor incident with no strategic significance. Others maintained that it represented a turning point in how the war was conducted on the Eastern Front, introducing elements of restraint and humanity that had been absent from the earlier fighting. But for the soldiers who were present that day, there was no debate about its significance. They had experienced something that proved war's noise, the dehumanizing roar of violence and hatred, could be silenced by a single voice speaking truth with absolute conviction. They had learned that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the most heroic act was not pulling the trigger, but having the wisdom and strength to refrain from doing so. Ekaterina Volkova retired from military service with more confirmed kills than almost any sniper in history. But she was proudest of the shot she didn't take and the words that stopped a war, even if only for an hour. Her warning had reminded an entire battlefield that beneath the uniforms and national flags, they were all somebody's children, deserving of the chance to go home and build something better than the world that had made them enemies. The noise of war eventually resumed, as it always does. But for one perfect hour in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, a legendary female sniper had given both sides the gift of silence. And in that silence, they had remembered what it meant to be human.